Next, let's talk about earthquakes, which are related to the fourth seal. The characteristic of the fourth seal is that along with the war and famine that appeared when the second and third seals were opened, there is an added element, death and being killed by the beasts of the earth. So killing by the beasts of the earth, as I explained last time, the beasts of the earth refer to living, moving things, right? So it means killing people through such things. Therefore, plagues or epidemics fall under this category. And especially when we look at Matthew 24, which follows the same sequence as Revelation 6, we can see this as well. Since this part is specifically mentioned as a plague, we have established that this indeed refers to a plague. Next, one of the reasons we interpret death as referring to earthquakes is that in Matthew 24, earthquakes are commonly mentioned instead of death. And in Luke 21 as well, the word earthquake is used instead of death. Therefore, the death mentioned here must refer to earthquakes, including them within its meaning. That's how we examined it. Let's read Luke chapter 21, verses 8, 10, and 11 together. He replied, "Watch out that you are not deceived." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilences in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven." Amen. In relation to what I just explained, I showed you a part of Luke chapter 21. So delusion is the first seal, and nation against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, the second seal. It's war. Then there's famine, the third seal. And what's left are great earthquakes and epidemics. So this corresponds to the fourth seal, which brings death and killing by the wild beasts. Regarding these earthquakes as well, some people say there were certainly earthquakes in the past too, but the frequency and intensity of those past earthquakes cannot be compared in any way to the earthquakes we are experiencing right now. These occurrences are becoming more and more frequent. I don't have enough time to present this in a graph or show you all the data, but if you're curious, please look up the information yourself. There should be plenty of data released by many experts available for you to find. You will be able to easily find plenty of information showing how the intensity of earthquakes has increased and their frequency has risen, especially over recent years, or the past 10, 20, or 30 years. So the earthquakes happening now are occurring far more frequently than ever before, to the point where it can't be compared to the past. Even in the video we just watched, you can see them happening continuously, just 2 or 3 days apart. Of course, I also think that person's view is a bit extreme. They might have selected only a fraction of the data, but the reality is that so many earthquakes are occurring one after another. So here, I'm showing you only the major earthquakes that have occurred so far, just the representative ones. Please take a look through them. As these keep happening in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and around Japan, the death toll alone reaches 43,000, 230,000, 86,000, 69,200, 146,000, 316,000, and 18,500. When we look at data like this, these massive numbers just keep coming at us. We hear hundreds of thousands or 200,000 and it just doesn't feel real. But in reality, these are truly staggering numbers. And so through these countless earthquakes, massive numbers of people are being killed. Ultimately, this was referred to as death. It's actually a spirit that works under the name of death. The spirit of death. In other words, the death spoken of here in the fourth seal is operating as the spirit of death. Next, let's look at plagues. Even long before COVID-19, the WHO was saying this: the 21st century is the age of pandemics. The 21st century is the age of pandemics. Before that, when we talked about pandemics, it was something we thought only happened in underdeveloped countries. That's how we used to think of it. Even just 10 years ago, because of pandemics, we never imagined we'd all have to go outside barely able to breathe. And now, if you don't wear a mask outside, you get fined. Who could have imagined that a time like this would come? even just 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. But now there are so many infectious diseases, and a lot of them are really scary, malignant ones that are becoming much more common. Because organizations like the WHO analyze and study these global trends, they said this long ago, even though we didn't know it back then. The 21st century is the era of pandemics. That's what they have been saying. And they are also saying that global warming is changing the map of diseases. So, these infectious diseases are very closely related to global warming and climate change. In fact, as I mentioned earlier about locusts, their ideal environment is when the climate is hot, very high temperatures combined with high humidity for a short period. That's when locusts thrive the most. So, when such an environment is created, these creatures rapidly reproduce and form swarms. In other words, these kinds of climate changes continuously affect living things, insects, and viruses, leading to these kinds of problems. Right after World War I, about 20 million people died from things like diphtheria and the flu, which caused major problems. But after that, in 1969, William Stewart, the US Surgeon General, said this: "The most infectious diseases are now coming to an end." In other words, he claimed they had been conquered. He declared that, thanks to the development of antibiotics and other drugs, we had more or less conquered infectious diseases. That was the official statement he made, but he failed to foresee what was coming. So since then, starting with avian influenza, all of these, what is referred to here as beasts, I mentioned that this term means living creatures, things that are alive and move, so it includes birds, insects, and so on. Therefore, avian influenza, mad cow disease, sepsis, SARS, MERS, Ebola, and new strains of flu, all of these are included. Now, with things like COVID-19 that we are experiencing, these infectious diseases are shaking the entire world. In fact, over the past few years, within a very short period, we've had MERS, Ebola, new strains of flu. They've kept coming, right? Yes, it's just been the last few years. As time goes on, it's as if we can't even catch our breath. Before vaccines can even be developed, another one comes and then another. And these kinds of situations keep arising. So this is what is being talked about here. Diseases like tuberculosis, measles, dysentery, malaria, typhoid, cholera, and epidemic influenza, infectious diseases that had already disappeared or for which treatments had been developed and thus rapidly vanished, are now re-emerging in various parts of the world. If you've watched the news this year or last year, those of you who remember the news will probably recall this. These infectious diseases, which existed back in the old days when we were young, in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, are now re-emerging and spreading in various parts of the world, even in developed countries, leading to deaths and similar incidents happening right now. So sepsis, this sepsis is such a sneaky disease and a hidden killer that even the WHO refers to it that way. Every year, 6 million people die from sepsis alone. And in the case of SARS, the SARS and MERS outbreaks we experienced are also types of coronavirus. These viruses mutate and, so to speak, give rise to various different types. So in the case of SARS, it was caused by a mutated coronavirus, and for MERS, it was the MERS coronavirus that was the cause, which spread through camels in the Middle East, as you know. That's why there were stories about it being transmitted through camels. The Zika virus, that was caused by mosquitoes. A huge number of people die because of mosquitoes. So many people are dying because of these tiny, seemingly powerless mosquitoes. And in the case of Ebola, it occurs through contact with the bodily fluids of animals, and its fatality rate is 70%. Ebola is that terrifying infectious disease where your internal organs start to dissolve inside you. You probably saw it on the news during the COVID-19 pandemic. You saw those photos from places like South America, Brazil, and even the United States, where they were digging massive graves in the ground. It was a situation where so many people were dying that they couldn't even hold proper funerals for everyone. Furthermore, in fact, experts are deeply worried now that as these mutations continue to occur, entirely new and mutated viruses. That's why experts say things like, COVID-19 is just beginning. That's the situation we're in. And as we saw in the previous video, Things like mosquitoes, dengue fever, yellow fever, and malaria, those are found in places like Africa, or in South America, those hot countries. But now these diseases are spreading globally. Because the climate is warming and more regions are turning subtropical, these diseases are spreading to wider areas. For these reasons, the number of people dying from diseases like malaria and dengue fever is increasing significantly. Every year, 1 million people die from malaria. 1 million people. My eldest child is currently working at a biotech company in New Jersey, and their main product is a malaria diagnostic kit. With the outbreak of the coronavirus this time, they developed this diagnostic kit, and I heard that there have been a huge number of orders coming in from all over. It seems that even in the US, this company is quite rare regarding this diagnostic kit for COVID-19. At first I wondered, can you really make money with malaria? But apparently over 1 million people die from malaria alone. So it must be profitable. That's right. So these infectious diseases keep coming back. And if we look at the main causes, it's ultimately these capitalist factors that lead to such tragedies. For example, cram in millions of animals and raise them, and when diseases occur, they inject antibiotics. And to get more milk, they use more antibiotics because inflammation develops, which must be tough for the animals too. So when inflammation occurs, they inject more antibiotics, and by doing these things, it ultimately becomes a disaster for humans. And while raising these animals, they feed them animal-based feeds and such. They feed these animals with genetically modified and artificially altered feeds, so these unfortunate creatures consume these substances, which then inevitably causes further detrimental mutations. And this relentless, vicious cycle keeps repeating itself endlessly. In the end, we see how human greed ultimately comes back to haunt us in the form of a devastating disaster. So, consequently, these extensively genetically modified grains and the various animals that we consume become persistent and ongoing causes for the alarming emergence of novel mutant viruses and the continuous dangerous mutations within these viruses. At this point, let's take another look at the real-time global statistics. Deaths caused by infectious diseases were, as of 7 p.m. yesterday, 11.69 million people. These statistics are all just for this year. So just this year alone, over 11.69 million people have died from infectious diseases. And if you look at deaths from abortion, that is 38.34 million, so about 40 million people. In 1 year, it is as if an entire country, an entire nation simply disappears due to abortion. This is the current reality. These staggering numbers of lives are being lost to abortion. So this is a history of death. It is the spirit of death at work. Was there ever this much abortion in the past? No, there wasn't. Ultimately, it's also deeply connected to sexual immorality. These kinds of things. So abortion too is the work of the spirit of death. This is the death being talked about in the fourth sea. There are 1.51 million deaths from AIDS alone. And the number of infected people exceeds 40 million. Around 60 million people have been infected with COVID-19, and so far, 1.4 million people have died. This is according to last night's statistics. And what I observe is that when we examine the concept of death, earthquakes, as they are described throughout the Holy Bible, can be representative of it. And there are these major events, So, as human life becomes urbanized and as many people flock to cities and live together, and as high-rise buildings and structures are built, people end up living in densely populated environments. These kinds of conditions, in other words, lead to major accidents. For example, we had the Sampung department store collapse. I don't know if any of you remember, but it was a huge deal at the time. The whole country was talking about it. The Sampung department store incident happened during President Kim Young-sam's administration. So, in other words, there was that kind of incident, and then the Daegu subway disaster happened. The subway is a kind of culture that has developed in urban areas, and it's a place where many people gather. When an accident happens in places like the subway, countless people can die. And in a way, this urbanization creates an environment where major disasters can occur. It's an environment created by human civilization. The Sangsu Bridge incident, back before I got married, when I was a reporter, where was it? Oh, Noryangjin. I was working at a magazine company near Noryangjin, so I was in the Noryangjin area. And since I always lived in Seongsu-dong, I used to cross the Sangsu Bridge all the time. So when the Sangsu Bridge collapsed, I was really shocked. But incidents like the Sangsu Bridge collapse and these kinds of things created by human civilization ultimately become environments where major accidents can happen. And through such events, countless people end up dying as part of the history of the realm of death, so to speak. So when I mention death here, I'm not referring solely to earthquakes. Earthquakes are just representative, but there are many other factors as well. In that sense, I included traffic accidents. Traffic accidents, for instance, occur as a result of our culture where many people drive cars. This year alone, over 1,215,000 people have died in traffic accidents, and more than 965,000 people have died by suicide. Suicide, too, is a very representative example of the spirit of death at work. So we've now looked at this in relation to the fourth seal. I've mentioned before that the fourth seal has a comprehensive character. So, issues related to the second seal, war and ethnic conflicts, as well as problems associated with the third seal, famine, and then the matters we've seen with the fourth seal, death and plagues, are all occurring simultaneously, more frequently, and with a wider distribution becoming a global trend. These things are happening right now. This fourth seal is followed by the fifth seal, which is about the martyrs. Now, in this fifth seal, what appears is, God, how long until you judge and avenge our blood? When will you judge? Or things like that. This is the scene where the souls who were killed are making such an appeal. So the fifth seal is about the martyrs. So these martyrs, as I mentioned, this fifth scene where they make such an appeal represents the story of the many martyrs that will arise during the period of the 1-7. Therefore, the era of the fourth seal is the time just before the 1-7 begins. So the period before the 1-7 begins, that generation, is exactly the time when the fourth seal is opened. As we've seen so far, these four things are happening comprehensively and simultaneously, and this is a global trend. It's not something happening locally or regionally, but rather it's occurring as a worldwide trend. You just heard these details. Do you feel this connects clearly enough to the fourth seal, killing by sword, famine, death, and the beasts of the earth? So the deception, the first seal, is a religious issue. And the second seal, the war, is a political issue. All wars are related to politics. And the third seal, famine, is an economic issue. And the fourth seal is a social issue. Problems such as widespread epidemics and numerous deaths caused by various accidents and incidents are social issues. In other words, as the seals from the first to the fourth are progressively being opened, the scenes that subsequently appear vividly show us a world that is truly groaning and suffering immensely in all critical areas, including religion, politics, economy, and society on a global scale. We are living in this very era right now. So, the time we are waiting for, the next thing that will come to us is the beginning of the 1-7, and once the 1-7 begins, it will go by quickly. It's 7 years. As the 7 years progress rapidly, the time of the coming of the Lord will arrive. So when we look at the significant overall movements happening in the world right now and diligently compare them with the sacred Bible and God's divine timetable, it is abundantly clear that now is the time for us to truly wake up and conscientiously prepare. This is what spiritually alert and discerning servants of the Lord and esteemed scholars from around the entire world are consistently proclaiming. So, as I mentioned last time, I think I talked about this in the first session, Dr. Walter Kaiser, who is world-renowned and an outstanding evangelical theologian. Most theologians and pastors are familiar with him. He is a tremendously influential evangelical theologian. He also stated that the Lord will return, perhaps in our lifetime, or in the lifetime of our children's generation. He has widely discussed and published many books on this topic. He has also published books that focus on the end times, and he has been traveling around the world giving lectures on these topics. He is now about 83 years old, and that's what he has said. Perhaps in our generation, or at the latest in our children's generation, the Lord will return. That's what he said. And he continues to travel around giving such lectures. And Dr. Daniel Just, who is also an outstanding theologian, is saying the same thing as well. So I'm not saying that we should be showing disasters or trying to scare people into staying awake, or that we should be interpreting the Bible with some kind of narrow-mindedness or prejudice and telling people to wake up. That's not what I'm talking about right now. What I'm telling you is that, based strictly on the Bible, as we interpret the book of Revelation, there are renowned and influential biblical scholars around the world, those who truly understand the Bible, who are all sharing the same message globally. They are carrying out ministries in anticipation of the Lord's return, preparing for that day, and I want you to know that this is happening right now. Let's read Matthew 24:33 to 34 together. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Amen. When I look at this verse, and when it says, you see all these things, it means that in the verse right before this, it talks about the first, second, third, and fourth seals, which are the same as what is being said in Revelation chapter 6. And then he says after that, and then he talks about the martyrs, about the tribulation, then about being saved. And then as he wraps up, he says, learn the lesson from the fig tree. And that's when he says these things. When you see all these things, know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. That's what he is saying. The way I interpret it, all these things refer especially to what was explained earlier, particularly related to the fourth seal. When you see these events happening, know that the Son of Man, Jesus, is truly near. Before this generation passes away. In other words, the generation that sees these things happen, these things will happen before this generation passes away. That's what Jesus says. Amen. And let me read Matthew 24:14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Amen. Of the 7.2 billion people, about 7 billion have a Bible in their own language. There is a Bible in your own language, 7 billion people. And the remaining population is now about 255 million. They are currently working on translating the Bible into their languages, and as I mentioned, the Global Bible Translators, also known as BPS Global, have said that they can complete this work by 2025. So, they are saying that the work of spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ to the ends of the earth, as mentioned in Matthew 24, can be completed by 2025. Of course, just because the Bible translation is finished doesn't mean that the time has come. There still needs to be time for people to receive the gospel through the Bible and to return to the Lord. So, I'm telling you that this generation we are living in now might very well be the generation that experiences the glorious era of Jesus' return. We are living in a time where we could witness this.